Now, many people criticize Roe, but remember, if you criticize Roe on the grounds that abortion does not appear in the Constitution, that may also make you criticize Griswold and Meyer and Pierce versus Society of Sisters. But is it really true that the Constitution permits states to forbid married couples from using contraceptives? Is it really true that the Constitution allows states to prohibit foreign language instruction? Is it really true that the Constitution allows states to prohibit private, say, religious schooling? Many critics of Roe don't want to go that far, and yet Roe and those decisions are analytically, methodologically, all of a piece. So the first observation I want to make to you is this. Roe is not methodologically unique. It's part of a long tradition of non-textual rights. You might accept that tradition, you might reject it, but intellectually it's very hard to pick and choose. Second observation. In another sense, Roe is arguably unique, at least among modern fundamental rights cases. This requires a little explanation. The extraordinary thing about Lochner versus New York and the decisions that followed from it, decisions that protected contractual and economic liberty, those decisions actively frustrated the political branches of government. For 40 years, Lochner disabled legislatures from engaging in the kinds of economic regulation to which they were politically committed. In other words, Lochner created a direct, sustained, head-on conflict between legislatures who were trying to regulate economic activity and courts who were, in many cases, preventing them from doing so. For most of the personal rights decisions, that is not true. Now, I need to speak clearly here because this is a subtle point. Of course, every constitutional decision overrules a legislative judgment. Every constitutional decision overrules a legislative judgment. That's a truism. If there were not a legislative judgment prohibiting X, there would be no occasion to decide that you have a constitutional right to do X. So every fundamental rights decision overrules a legislative judgment. But in most of the personal rights cases, the law struck down was rather plainly out of step. Out of step with the political mainstream of the country. Most laws struck down under modern fundamental rights, substantive due process, privacy, most of them are politically weak. That is to say, the laws struck down were marginal. They were outliers. They were odd duck statutes of the sort that the legislature was not terribly committed to. Now, take Griswold as an example of what I mean here. The Connecticut statute in Griswold banned the use of contraceptives even by married couples. Only one other state had such a statute, and in neither state was the law actually enforced. The recollection of all Yale students of that era, of whom I'm one, is that condoms were freely available in Connecticut drugstores, no questions asked, no subterfuges necessary, despite the statute. In fact, the statute was never enforced against married couples. It was enforced against birth control clinics. But the Griswold court didn't focus on birth control clinics. It focused, do you remember the opinion, on the sanctity of marriage. But there was no history at all of enforcing such a statute against married couples, and no substantial political constituency for doing so. What I mean to say is this. Yes, Griswold overruled an enactment of the legislature of Connecticut, but it was an odd law, not a law that other states had, not a law that Connecticut enforced, not a law that the political mainstream was committed to having. Most of the fundamental rights decisions are of that character. I sometimes think of them like a mirror. The Supreme Court holds up a mirror to American society, and every now and then it finds a blemish, an imperfection in the glass, something that is a little out of focus, and it corrects it. That's what Griswold looks like. It's correcting something that's a little out of focus about American law. In this sense, Roe is arguably unique among modern cases. Because in Roe, the Supreme Court did not merely remove a little imperfection. It did not merely address an oddball statute. It did not strike down an outlier. Roe invalidated the abortion laws of virtually all American states. And abortion laws were taken seriously at the time and enforced routinely by the authorities. And abortion was not some little detail or insignificant matter that no one had focused on. Abortion was an issue that many people on both sides of the question viewed as supremely important. It is perfectly clear, historically, perfectly clear, that in 1973, when Roe v. Wade was announced, that if the states had been allowed to do otherwise, they would have. It's been more than 20 years, and that probably is still true. If states were allowed to adopt abortion laws, many states would be much more restrictive than the Constitution allows. In other words, Roe and Griswold are alike intellectually. Roe and Griswold are alike analytically, but they are unalike historically and politically. Roe is one of the very few cases since 1937 in which the Supreme Court has frustrated a committed and durable political judgment. So in terms of the degree of conflict, in terms of the extent to which the Supreme Court is actually frustrating political judgments, Roe is an exceptional case. Third observation. Roe versus Wade is often thought of as radical con law. I guess it's radical in the sense that there isn't any text, there isn't any history, there isn't any inference from structure. It is a sort of out of the blue decision, or often portrayed that way. But I want to suggest one way in which Roe is distinctly unradical. Indeed, I want to suggest one respect in which Roe and the fundamental rights cases generally are in some sense very conservative. They are very closely aligned with the agenda of the middle class. Fundamental rights under our Constitution are very closely aligned with the agenda of the middle class. Now, you may not have ever had occasion to think about it quite this way. Maybe you don't want to venture such a thing on an exam, but let me give you just an idea to play with. Think about what's included in our current understanding of fundamental rights. What are the fundamental personal rights that we cherish under the Constitution? Marriage, procreation, the family, raising your children as you wish, etc. Some of these choices, such as the right to attend private school, are only meaningful if you have the funds to enjoy them. The question of whether you have a constitutional right to attend private school simply doesn't come up among very poor people. Many other rights can be enjoyed equally well by rich and poor, but here's the point. There is nothing in the list of fundamental rights that has particular relevance to the poor. Nothing in the list of fundamental rights that requires the redress of maldistribution of wealth. These are all matters that middle-class people care about. Now look at what's out. Look at what is not a fundamental right under the cases. What are not fundamental rights? Housing. No fundamental right to housing. What is not a fundamental right? Education. There may be a fundamental right to some minimal level of educational opportunity, but in general, education is not a fundamental right. Many of you will have read San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, which has to do with inequalities of funding, no fundamental right to education, at least above a very minimum level. And the most important, there is no fundamental right to a job. Now, when the government starts passing economic regulation that kicks you out of your job, that destroys your livelihood, that destroys your economic independence and your economic identity, what does the Supreme Court do? Nothing. Williamson versus Lee Optical. They wipe your business out. If you can't work in this profession, too bad. That's economic regulation. You have no fundamental right to a job. What do housing, education, and jobs have in common? They're all things the middle class have and the poor need. And the fundamental rights protected by the Supreme Court do nothing to vindicate the interest of the economically disadvantaged, or the special interest of the economically disadvantaged. The clearest example of all, of course, is abortion funding. Do you have a constitutional right to an abortion? Yes. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. Every woman has a right to an abortion, at least if she's above a certain age and has competence to make the decision. Every adult woman has a right to an abortion. But what if you cannot afford the abortion? What if no clinic offers free services? What if the clinic that's available to you is too far away? Answer, too bad. You have a constitutional right to abortion, but you have no right to abortion funding. The government can prevent funding for abortion even if it pays for live births. Now, do not infer from what I've said that this is a campaign to persuade you that these decisions are wrong. That's not my point at all. It's a campaign to bring to your field of vision a very important fact. I think it is descriptively factual about fundamental rights. Namely, fundamental rights are concerned chiefly with issues, at least chiefly, maybe exclusively, with issues of importance to the middle class. And they contribute little or nothing to the betterment of the poor. In that sense, Roe versus Wade and fundamental rights are not radical at all. In that sense, they are deeply attached to the social agenda of the status quo. Well, the material that we've covered in this hour is certainly some of the most controversial in con law. There are many different opinions and many different approaches, different theories on fundamental rights and on substantive due process. I hope this overview of the landscape has helped you bring some of this material into focus, and I hope the three concluding observations will give you some raw material that you can use to your advantage on a con law exam. Hour 4 will deal with equal protection. Thank you.